Well, we're joined now by John Sandwich, who is a former acting director of ICE under President Obama. He joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Mr. Sandwich, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been about a week, hasn't it, since 37-year-old Renee Good was shot and killed in her car in Minneapolis. There's now been this fresh shooting in Minneapolis as well of a Venezuelan man. Is it fair to say things are extremely tense only in the state of Minnesota, or would you say the tensions have spread right across the country?
I think it's fair to say the tensions are spread across the country. I think that incident, that tragedy involving Ms. Good really brought more attention to what is going on with the immigration enforcement. That said, I would say that that the attention is focused more in large urban cities that tend to be more democratic. I think there's less concern in those areas that are more supportive of the president. But also the way in which the administration has done these deployments is they've done it in some targeted cities, most famously, Chicago, Los Angeles, and now Minneapolis. And certainly in those cities where there's been this expanded DHS, ICE, and U.S. Border Patrol presence, there's been a lot more focus on it. But listen, this incident caught the nation's attention and certainly triggered a vigorous debate in the United States about how smart or necessary is this mass deportation effort.
Okay, let's just zero in, shall we, on what happened to Renee Good. I mean, you've seen the videos. Videos were shot from different angles of the scene. What was your assessment looking at those videos of just what happened to her?
It's from my experience working at the department, whenever you have an officer involved shooting, you really need to just hold back on making a judgment until you can gather all of the evidence. Certainly, I would say a couple of things about the videos. One, they're horrific to watch. Two, it's a tragedy that I firmly believe never should have happened. And I hope we all look back on this and figure out what could we have done differently to prevent this, not just at that very milliseconds when the officer had to make this incredibly difficult decision, but what was everything that led us to that point? But in terms of whether or not the officer's use of force was justified, it's hard. Listen, I'm looking at 3 videos. I'm not out there interviewing all the witnesses. I'm not talking to the officer and hearing what he was seeing. I'm not looking at any additional security camera footage they might have developed. I'm not looking at evidence related to the angles of the bullets or any of that information, or even really aware of the officer's, what the injuries he might have suffered. And so I think as a result of all of that, it's impossible for someone like me to make a judgment. But of course, we had senior leaders very quickly make judgments. And candidly, Tom, I was very surprised, and I thought that was irresponsible of them. The standard protocol, for a lot of very good reasons, is to hold back on making any judgments until an investigation is completed.
Right. So what you're saying is that the assessment very shortly after that shooting by the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, calling Renee Good a domestic terrorist, you're saying that was hasty and doesn't sound like it sat very well with you.
Tom, listen, a couple of things. One is, first of all, remember, ICE serves the United States of America. Unfortunately, it is being viewed right now as a partisan agency. And it's almost as if you have to take sides. But the bottom line here is that we should all want to make sure we get at the truth, and that we may have an objective determination of responsibility that's based on facts. And you can't make a decision until you have those facts. I worked at DHS for 5 years, including my stint at ICE. And during that 5 years, I will tell you, we had lots of crises, and that initial information you get is always wrong. There's just that right after things happen, people are flowing information up as quickly as possible, and it's not always verified. And I think what I would say is to make a judgment based on that initial information is highly irresponsible. But of course, the other problem is this, that now we've rushed out there and said, absolutely justified shooting. She's a domestic terrorist. She's crazy. Before we've done before we've interviewed any witnesses or really gathered any facts. Now that when this investigation is complete, it is impossible for the public to view that in any way, shape, or form as a credible investigation, right? The secretary herself has doubled down. The vice president has come out and said this was a justified shooting and that Ms. Good was a domestic terrorist. And as a result of all of that, no matter what the investigators actually determine, there's just no way anybody's going to believe it's credible, because the political leadership has already weighed in and made their determination.
Right. So it sounds to me like you're saying that the level of public trust in ICE right now is pretty low.
Tom, I think that is a major problem here. While there are still a significant percentage of people that passionately support the president and this initiative, I think ICE is getting a black eye here. There's been a lot of changes in how ICE is being utilized in this administration that, in my opinion, has put these agents in a very difficult spot and contributed to circumstances like what happened to Ms. Good. But absolutely, you have serious questions in the public about what ICE is doing and these things that they see on TV. How do those promote public safety? But you also have concerns about the credibility, about what the agency says is accurate. The agency likes to say, hey, we're targeting the worst of the worst, right? We're going after all these criminals who are at large. The President Biden led it. But the data doesn't support that, right? 75% of the people in ICE custody, or 70%, are individuals with no criminal convictions ever. Right? You hear these cases of mothers and people who, came to the United States 5 years ago and were let in legally to make an asylum claim, and they're being arrested in droves, people arrested in courts. And so, yes, I think there's a credibility gap growing where the administration says this is only focused on predators, but the data doesn't support that. Or they rush out and say that Ms. Good was trying to kill agents with her car. She was driving at them to try to strike them down. And then everyone sees the video and says, well, that doesn't look true to me based on the video. It looks like she was just trying to get away. Doesn't mean, again, the shooting wasn't justified, but it means that there's just another instance where there's this growing credibility gap. And ultimately, Tom, very quickly, as the former acting director of ICE, I can tell you that really hurts the agency's ability to do its job. ICE does serve a critical mission in the United States. It does have great agents who are trying to make the country safer. But when you have this credibility gap, it just really makes it hard for them to do that work going forward.
Right, and you've been quoted as saying that ICE has been politicized. You've also been quoted as saying that the hiring practices at ICE are perhaps questionable in some instances. What's changed on that front?
Well, two things quickly. One is, look, immigration enforcement in the United States is always a difficult business, Tom. It's always been very politicized. This country has not made up its mind what does it want to do about the 11 to 12 million people who are in this country unlawfully. There is widespread consensus. Let's get the criminals off the streets. There's very broad support for that. But when it comes to people who might have entered the United States 20 years ago and really integrated into our society, had children who are U.S. citizens, maybe married a U.S. citizen, don't have a criminal history, the country's divided. So in that sense, ICE has always been a little bit political. But this administration has really used ICE as a tool. The president has been very clear. He wants to go after Democrat cities, right? And the cities that have really been the focus of these operations, Chicago, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, are, of course, cities that have traditionally voted against the president. And in a way, what the administration has done, the way they're using ICE, is no longer, it's now becoming a litmus test in a way about whether you support the president or you're opposed to the president. And if you support the president, then you support ICE and the tactics they use. And my frustration is ICE is a law enforcement organization. There's an agency that's dedicated to protecting all Americans. And for over 20 years, with Republican and Democrat presidents, ICE has gone out there and arrested bad guys and got them off the streets, and done it without all of this controversy, without all of this drama. I'm not suggesting there weren't incidents where there are questions about use of force or shootings, but nothing. This has been 1 year, Tom, and we have all of these shootings and all of these visual images of confrontations between the public and ICE, all of these protesters. The manner in which the agency is being used right now has politicized it in a way, like I said, that makes it less effective going forward and is going to weaken public safety in the United States.
One of the other things you're quoted as having said is criticizing the administration for announcing ICE raids before they are carried out. And I'm wondering why you criticize them. Does that deviate from standard practice, announcing a raid before it's done?
It is a tremendous deviation, Tom. When throughout my time working at the department, I wasn't an officer, right? I was a lawyer, then became the acting director, not uncommon, but it is preached by all the agents how critical it is that there be operational secrecy, that when we are planning a massive operation, the last thing we want to do is announce it publicly, because all you're doing is letting the bad guys know you're coming. And what happens, Tom, as a result of that, as you can imagine, is when you go to look for that convicted felon who, now that you've announced we're coming to Minneapolis to get criminal aliens off the streets, well, he flees. He goes into hiding. And now when we go to the house where we think he is, because we've warned him in advance, he's not there. Or even worse, we've put our officers in jeopardy because now he knows ICE is coming and he says, that's it. I'm going to get my gun ready. I'm going to be on guard. I'm going to be waiting for them when they get here. It just undermines the safety of the officers themselves, the agents, and it undermines the effectiveness of the operation. And Tom, one other thing quickly, it has also triggered these protests. And the vast majority of these protesters are Americans who are horrified at what they're seeing and don't want this massive presence in their cities and are out there exercising their U.S. constitutional rights to protest. But there's some bad apples in there too, people who want to who are assaulting these ICE agents. But by announcing publicly we're coming and by doing these very demonstrable shows of force instead of that more quieted traditional law enforcement where you get in, you get the bad guy, and you get out, we have created a scenario where now we put the public in greater danger when they have these confrontations with the ICE officers, and we put the ICE officers themselves in greater danger. And Tom, quickly, the administration always likes to talk about these data about how many assaults are how many increased numbers of assaults on ICE agents there have been, or incidents where people are throwing things at them, or they're getting struck by, punched, or just other incidents, these vehicular incidents. But so much of that is a byproduct of that very thing, of publicly announcing them, thus increasing the risks to the agents themselves and increasing the likelihood that they're going to be assaulted. I really think the administration is doing a real disservice to these agents by not just putting them out of position, but by publicly announcing they're coming and thus increasing the threats that they face.
And just explain to our audience briefly why you think the administration does make these announcements. What's to be gained from it as far as they're concerned?
Well, it goes back to what I said. I mean, I think the administration likes the politics of this, right? But I think what people don't understand is what the images they see on TV is not traditional immigration enforcement. This is not what ICE has done. And this is a point, Tom, I want to drill into people's heads, is that ICE has arrested millions of people since its inception but did it so quietly. I'm not saying they didn't generate controversy. ICE has always been controversial because of its immigration mission, but it was able to do this quietly in a way that was more targeted and lower profile, that kept the public safer and kept the agents themselves safer. And so I worry that people sit here and say, and the administration wants to characterize it this way, saying you're either for immigration enforcement and for getting criminal, or against, or you're in favor of criminal aliens, letting them stay on the streets. That is a false proposition. That is a false choice. The reality is you can do immigration enforcement, do it in a way that ICE has effectively done it traditionally, in which they've deported millions of people with criminal convictions over 2 decades without having these controversies. And Tom, if I may just say one more thing very briefly, is that part of the other problem with these protests is that the administration has the ICE agents themselves policing. And so all these images we see of Border Patrol agents in their tactical gear, or ICE agents in tactical gear confronting these protesters, that's just not what ICE is trained to do. It's not their historic mission. And so why we have these ICE agents have put them in this position where they have to deal with those things and leave them vulnerable to, like I said, rock throwing or other types of assault. It's really, really unfair to the agency itself.
Right, so you're painting a picture of a pretty bleak situation for ICE. Its public standing has been undermined, you're saying. Their effectiveness is undermined by announcements ahead of time, meaning that the raids aren't as safe or as effective as they could be. And talking to your former colleagues and former friends at ICE, how would you describe the level of morale in the agency right now?
There's certainly going to be a small element there who supports what's happening here. And Tom, one thing we neglected to talk about, I'll just say very briefly as well, is that even when the agency sets out and says, okay, we're going to arrest these 10 people today, a big difference here is that who they're selecting, right? Historically, the agency would say, when we go out in the streets in Minneapolis to get 10 people, we're getting 10 bad guys. We're making sure that we're getting the worst first, right? The most serious offenders first. This administration's been very vocal about this, that it's about volume, right? So the first thing is they're grabbing people who, as I've mentioned a minute ago, don't have any criminal history. There's a small percentage at ICE, good agents who want to do right, but who do believe personally that we should enforce our immigration laws against every undocumented immigrant in the country. I would say, though, the majority of people at ICE that I worked with recognize a fundamental fact, Tom, which is that even with the souped up ICE that the administration is seeing, right, and you mentioned it a second ago, they've got all this money from Congress to dramatically increase the size of the agency. But even with that increased agency, there's still a limited number of people who can be arrested and deported in a year. And the vast majority of agents I worked with historically say we can only get, let's say it's 1 million in a year. And there's 12 million here plus another let's say 20 million potential targets. Let's make sure we first get the bad guys, the ones who are most likely to commit serious crimes in the country, the ones who have criminal histories, who are violent criminals, the criminal gang members. Let's focus in on them. Why are we wasting our time confronting protesters or grabbing people who are married to a U.S. citizen and have 3 kids and have lived here 15 years? That's a waste of our resources. Let's go get those bad guys first. And they are incredibly frustrated. And at the end of the day, Tom, people want to have pride in where they work. And a lot of the agents now realize that that a significant percentage of that they're being labeled as a rogue agency, right? An arm of the administration. And there's tremendous frustration, I guess I would say. It's quiet because, you're not in those jobs, you're not supposed to. To credit to them, go out there and go public with your concerns. But I can tell you off the record, from my off the record conversations with agents, there's certainly a lot of frustration and disappointment that they don't feel like they are being utilized in a way that maximizes public safety in the United States.
Okay, so just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, someone who voted for President Trump would say the president is delivering on a key campaign pledge, which is to crack down on illegal immigration into the United States. What would you say to someone who thought along those lines? And what would you say to them if they said, and he's not only delivering this promise, he's also delivering some good results? How would you counter that?
Yeah, what I'd say, Tom, to that person is 2 things. First of all, is like I feel like the administration should be honest, and they are. Many members of the administration are honest about this. Although I feel like the department's official statements are still fostering, raising credibility questions. And then what I would say is, one is, let's be honest that this is mass deportation focused on all undocumented immigrants or individuals who fall into hybrid areas, like people who come up and are waiting for their asylum case. This is not just about the worst of the worst or the criminals. The data shows that it's not. I can tell you by the nature of the operations they are conducting, it is not. But let's just be honest with the public and say, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to deport all undocumented. To be fair, I think a fair number of the people in the administration are clear about that. I just feel like a lot of times what is coming out of DHS right now is saying, okay, we're only focused on the worst of the worst. But what I would also tell that person is, it doesn't have to be this way. You could say, hey, John, I disagree with you. We should not be focused on the worst first. Let's go ahead and get everybody off the streets. That'll make the country safer. But what I would say is, we can do this in a way that is less controversial, less politicized, less traumatic to the United States, less likely to result in the shootings of people like Renee Good, and equally effective, if not more effective, from an immigration enforcement perspective. It's how they're going about it in this very noisy, overt, controversial way that's tearing at the fabric of the U.S. politically, rather than going about it quietly, that is, frankly, more effective from an enforcement perspective.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. John Sandwyk, former acting director for ICE under President Obama. Thank you for your time, sir.